Okay, I think we got that straightened out. So hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, good riddance to bad rubbish, good breeds bad breeds, who knows. Anyway, I never have anything useful to say at the beginning of these things. It's enough that I can just like be here. It may not be enough for people watching. They may be going, oh my God, is this guy talking about nothing again? But it's the best I can do. If I had something useful to say, I'd be a writer or something. Anyway, good morning to you all. Those of you who are in the European-ish part of the world, those of you who are in other parts of the world, your time zones may vary, and such is life. Here in California, in what is called Northern California, even though, as my daughter pointed out, we're right in the middle of the state. But technically, once you get much up north of Los Angeles, everything's considered Northern California, which just shows you how self-centered all those people in Southern California are, that they can just completely ignore the rest of the state. Oh, that's all Northern California. Yeah, well, that's most of the state. Anyway, I wouldn't want you to think there was any sort of north-south rivalry going on in California. No. Anyway, so hi, I am here. It's been another interesting, busy day and weekend. Managed to get some work done, got some other things done. Practiced some because I'm playing music with my brothers tomorrow. Should be back in plenty of time to do the evening reading for those of you who are masochistic enough to try to attend both. And what else is going on? Working on Navigator's Children, doing some light editing on Into the Narrow Dark while I wait for it to come back from my publisher with the publishing editing comments so that I can incorporate them into the final version of Into the Narrow Dark. And just saw the final, or almost the final map for Brothers of the Wind, which Isaac Stewart is doing, and it's lovely. Very, very fine map. It's very similar to the main Ostenard map that some of you have seen in the other books, Witchwood Crown, Empire of Grass. But of course, the names are different because it takes place 1,000 years in the past, so many of the places have different names than they do. But the land is still roughly the same. 1,000 years is not much in geological time. So anyway, that's what I've been working on this week. And then we're just doing stuff. We're cooking, we're hanging out, we're trying not to go out more than we have to while the Delta variant is flourishing. And, you know, we don't want to be part of the problem because we're all vaccinated now, but you can be vaccinated and catch the variants, or you can also transmit them to other people. So we don't want to be doing that. When we go out, we wear masks, etc., etc. So the pandemic that started this whole reading thing a year and a half ago is still with us, and I'm still reading. God, maybe I caused it somehow. Anyway, no, I started after the pandemic. That's right. Okay. I was a little worried there. My whole grasp on causality is a little fuzzy anyway. That's why I became a fantasy and science fiction writer. So let me say hello to the people who have popped in to say hello to me. And first off, top of the list is Olaf. And hello, Olaf. Guten Tag. Always a huge pleasure to see you. Wouter, you are back. All right, good. Well, I'm glad you got to visit your family, and I hope all the family are good. And everybody's good here. Nobody is sick. Everybody is healthy. We had to take our smallest dog off to the vets, and he had to stay overnight at the vets because he was seizing. You know, he occasionally has little seizures, and but he had one he couldn't get out of, so we had to take him into the vet, and they kept him overnight. Now he's going to be on phenobarbital, which my very, very old golden retriever, I say very old, she's not with us anymore. She died several years ago, but she made it to pretty close to 18 years old, and we always thought that was probably something to do with the phenobarbital. We figured her heart was only beating 3 or 4 times a day. She was so heavily drugged because she also had seizures. So we're hoping that this will keep Walter. He doesn't have very often he doesn't have the sort of grand mal type seizures. He just has these weird little ones where he can't turn his head to one side, and he's very agitated and upset, and it's hard to tell, but he makes a lot of, distress noises and things like that, no matter how much we try and soothe him. So we'll hope that the phenobarb helps. Johnny Big Dog, who is actually Walter's subordinate. Walter Tiny Dog is Johnny's boss because he's the older dog. Anyway, Johnny was very worried and upset with Walter gone, and he was very happy when Walter came back. So all's well that ends well in the dog arena, and that's what we've been doing. And other than that, everybody is well. So, Chris, after 2 weeks of vacation, hello, good to have you back. Iris, hello, good morning. Dirk, hello from Berlin. Got a lot of folks in Berlin. You guys should all hang out together. Cliff, hi Cliff. We are doing well. I hope you and your family are doing well too. But thank you for the wishes. Mark, good morning, and lovely to hear from West Yorkshire. Always a pleasure. As you know, and I'm going to be saying hello to my mother-in-law next, but you know my wife, of course, very Yorkshire-oriented, even though she grew up in the West Midlands. But she went to University of Manchester, and so that's always been a big part of her personality. She has friends in Yorkshire. Next time we're in England, we're going to go visit some of them. So it's always nice to hear from the Yorkshire part of the attendees. So anyway, Hazel, good morning, sweetie. That's my mother-in-law. Good morning, Hazel. Good to see you. Petra, hello, and from both you and Christine, well, a pleasure. Thank you for checking in. Carol, good to see you. Jessica, good to see you too, also in rainy northern Germany. And there's Kristen. Hello, Kristen. You braved the broadcast even though you're having reception problems, I hear. So, well, thank you for that, Faith. I'm not sure there's anything I can do from my end except just try to read clearly and audibly. Andre, hello, good to see you. And there's Kristen. Oh, I see. Okay, that first one was a failed attempt. It just said helly, and now it says hello. So, message received. James, hello, buddy. Good to see you. And who else? James, other James. This is James D. Scott. The previous one was James Worfs. James Scott, g'day. G'day from Rushcutters Bay. Rushcutters Bay. I don't even know where that is, but I'm assuming it's somewhere in Oz. Cindy, good morning. Good to see you. And California is hundreds of miles long. You could put all of the UK inside of California. Not that that's like somehow makes it superior in any way, shape, or form, but it is larger. I used to have to explain that to my British friends. And then they'd have to explain to me how we Californians are crazy because we drive long distances. And I'd say, we have no choice. You know, I mean, half my friends live in Southern California. That's minimum 5-6 hour drive to get to them, which is, you know, like going from the south of England all the way up to the highlands of Scotland. But it's still by us considered to be, you know, same state, not that far away. Anyway, so who else was I saying hello to before I got confused? I'm so easily confused. Oh yeah, Kristen was talking about the size of California. Jeremy, hello. Yes, there is a guitar on my chair. It is not a Chekhovian guitar. I am not going to shoot anybody with it. At the end of the reading, it's there because I had it out the other day before I found a working bass. Because that was what I was going to take along to practice, was my acoustic. But I found a working bass, and that's what I'm using, because I'm actually better at that than I am at guitar. And both of my brothers are better guitar players than I am, so I know my limits. Holger, good evening from Waldesruhe. Well, good to see you. A bit chilly. Well, I'm not surprised. When you read my books, okay, Holger is asking a question here, so give me a moment to parse this out. I had a question in the back of my mind for a while. When you read your books, how do you feel? Do you still think your books are okay from a story point of view, or do you think from today's perspective you would have done something different? Bitte nicht zu schnell sprechen. Mein Englisch ist nicht so gut. Beim Geschriebenen helfen mit Übersetzer. I will try to speak a little more slowly. So as far as the books go, it's actually, they're all different because the span of books that I've been reading here and short stories and everything is like 30 years. So in some ways, I've definitely changed as a writer, and it's hard not to occasionally look at things and say, I would probably do that differently. For one thing, for my early books, I would probably go back and just wholesale take out a whole bunch of commas. I feel as though I used too many commas when I was a young writer starting out. I shouldn't even tell you that, because probably then if you go back and read any of those books, you'll be noticing them now. And, you know, it'll be like having rats in the walls or something. You'll be constantly going, this must be what he meant. Look at all those commas. But anyway, so that's the main thing I notice, are stylistic and syntactical things that I wouldn't do now. Other than that, no. I'm very glad to say that when I reread Tailchaser's Song, which was my very first book and the first thing of mine that ever got published, I was prepared to be disappointed, or at least slightly shamed, and instead said, you know, that's still a pretty good story. And plus, I see the infant form of many of my obsessions and things like that. I could see in the book, and it was funny because I hadn't read it in so long that, you know, it was really quite new to me, some of it, you know, or at least so far in the past I didn't remember until I got to certain parts and went, oh yeah, that character, or oh yeah, that thing. But because of that, I was able to read it more like a regular reader. But of course, I also am me, and I've been doing this now for 30 plus years, 35 years or more. And as a result, I also see things, especially in Tailchaser's Song, it's like, yeah, that's the first time I used that trope. But boy, I have beaten the hell out of that trope since then. You know, that's one of my favorites. And they're really, it's pretty much all there in infant form, you know, in Tailchaser's Song. There's, you know, the ambivalent hero, there's the love of folklore and mythology, there are the underground journeys, there are the disaffected villain who is not evil for evil's sake but feels justified, and there are, you know, all kinds of, there the unexpected companions that one picks up along the way, and there is the trope of finding out that some of the history you learned was wrong. I mean, there's a lot of things that showed up later in all of my stuff, because I guess they're just personal tropes of mine. There, I hope I said that a little more slowly, Holger, so that that was easier to understand. Your English is very good when you write it, but I forget sometimes. When I do book tours in places like Germany or other places where English is the second language, as good as everybody, as well as everybody speaks English, or most people do in places like Germany or Scandinavia or the Netherlands or wherever, most places actually, I still try to speak more clearly the way I'm doing now and a little more slowly. Unfortunately, in the course of reading, I sometimes lose track of that and read a little faster than I need to. And certainly when I'm talking, unofficially, like at the beginning of a reading like this, I oftentimes lapse into my regular high-speed American talking to other Americans kind of way. So I apologize for that. I can't promise I won't do it, but I'm not as conscious about it when I'm sitting in my own home as I am when I'm, reading on a stage in, Cologne or Berlin or somewhere like that, where I'm thinking, yeah, some of these people probably, they speak English the way I speak Spanish, so they're not going to grasp every single word, and I should go slowly and make lots of hand gestures so people understand what I am saying, that kind of thing. Anyway, Eva, hello, dearest. How are you? Just a quick hi from rainy Hamburg. Oh, so you're visiting friends up in the north. Cool. Well, say hello to them from me, told them I said. Howdy from America. Who else have we got here? Who has checked in to say hello? Or is everybody now just talking to themselves? Yeah, they're mostly talking to themselves. Andre, hello. And also calling in from Berlin. At the Max Moritz. Yes, I remember that. That was good fun. Sandra, checking in from Johannesburg, or Joburg, as people call it there. Dogs happy and naughty. Oh, good to hear it. Dogs should always be happy. They don't have to always be naughty, but they should be happy. Anybody else? Jeremy, I already said hello to. Wouter, Holger. You guys are just talking to each other. You don't even need me. Anya, hello. Anya's checking in from Rosenheim. And I think that's everybody. So not that there's anything wrong with you guys talking to each other. In fact, I strongly encourage it. I love it when readers of mine meet other readers of mine, and especially readers of mine who are also friends of mine, who I've met and had a chance to hang out with, and they get to meet other people that I like and become friends. That's a very cool situation. So when I say, God, everybody's talking to each other, I'm saying that only because I'm going down trying to see who I still have to say hello to, and every single comment I'm coming to is somebody that I've already said hello to saying hello to somebody else I've already said hello to, and it gets confusing. Anyway, we go back to Shadowmarch, which, as I keep mentioning, we are getting closer and closer to the end of this rather fat volume. There's too much going on now to try and bring everybody up to date on what's going on. The chapter we've just been reading is that Chert, after finding Flint and taking him home again, after finding Flint at the base of the mysterious Shining Man statue down deep, deep beneath the castle in the area the Thunderlings call the Mysteries, Chert has been summoned by the girl Willow, who you might remember Ferris Vanson basically brought out of the wilderness, where her family had vanished into the spreading twilight. She showed up at Chert's door down in the Chert and Opal's door down in Thunderling Town, and told him that her master wanted to see him and needed to see him, and it was very important. And so Chert is going with her, even though Opal is not happy about it since he has just returned. And Flint hasn't even woken up yet since his weird adventure. So anyway, Chert has just gone out of the house, Whoops, here, let's make a little space. Chert has just gone out of the house. Chert made a few wrong turns on his way back, since this time he didn't have the girl Willow to guide him. The big folk dashing here and there around the castle seemed even more distracted than might seem warranted, with siege preparations still going on. And at first he thought it a little strange that no one bothered to question a lone Thunderling wandering through the grounds. Then he remembered that today was Winter's Eve, the day before Orphan's Day, one of the most important holidays on the big folks' calendar. Despite the fear of war, they seemed to be preparing for a feast and other entertainments. Chert saw more than a few groups of courtiers in costumes even more elaborate than usual, and a trio of young girls seemed to be dressed as geese or ducks. The man named Gil was sitting as still as a statue in a patch of weak morning sunlight in the garden when Chert found the place at last. Chert couldn't help wondering if the stranger had waited on that bench all the night long, ignoring winter chill and the soaking dew. Gil looked at him as if hours had not passed, as if they had only left off their conversation moments earlier. "Now we will go," he said, and stood, showing no stiffness. Indeed, he was weirdly graceful, displaying such economy of movement that what at first sight appeared slow and awkward soon began to seem more subtle, movement without wasted effort, so that even his most mundane acts might have been the carefully planned steps of an elaborate dance. "Hold a moment." Chert glanced around, but the garden seemed to be one of the few spots in the castle empty of people, preparing for either siege or feast. "We can't just walk out the basilisk gate, you know. The castle is at war. The guards won't let us, not to mention that the causeway is down. You say we must reach the city on the other side. We would have to find a boat, and the bay is dangerous today. Some say a storm is coming." Gil regarded him. "What does this mean?" Chert let out a snort of exasperation. "Means you haven't thought this part out very carefully, is what it means. We'll have to find some other way. You can't fly, can you? I didn't think so. Then you'll have to come back with me to Thundering Town. There are tunnels, old roads, secret roads that lead under the bay. They're not much used anymore, even by us. We can go that way, or at least it's worth a try." Gil continued to look at him, then sat down. "I cannot go down into Thundering Town, as you call it. It is too close to the deep places, to the thing you call the Shining Man. I cannot go there. And we have hit bedrock with no tools." Chert wished again that Chavin had not vanished. Cryptic strangers and magical mirrors, the mysteries coming to life. The portly physician would have had something useful to say. He always did. "Ah," Chert said. "Ah, wait a moment." He considered. "The girl told me you have been living in the castle stronghold. That is beneath the ground." Gil nodded his head slowly. "That is not so deep, I think. I feel it only a little. I know a way that also does not go too deep, at least not at first. When we are far away from the Shining Man, if that is what you really fear, we can go deeper. Follow me." As he led the stranger across the inner keep, certain now for the first time of where he was going, he tried to plan what he would say to Chavin's housekeeper or to the manservant. What was that suspicious old man's name? Harry? Could he convince them of some errand so they would allow him to go through the house unsupervised? He didn't think any of them knew about the tunnel and the door off the cellar hallway. He was still scheming when they reached the stubby observatory tower But the tale he had cobbled together, an important sample of stone Chavin had been testing for him, but which Chert now urgently needed back, was to remain unused. Nobody answered to his knock. The door was bolted, although Chert jiggled it to make sure. A layer of dirt on the threshold had been damped by the mist and drizzled into a muddy film, naked of footprints, as though nobody had gone in or out for several days. He shook the handle again, but the door was latched tight. It seemed that in Chavin's long absence the servants had closed up the house. With sinking heart he began to explain to Gil, but realized that the odd man saw nothing that needed explaining. Chert looked up to the second-floor window and its wooden balcony. Perhaps the shutters there were less securely guarded. "Can you climb?" he asked. Gil gave him that now familiar, annoyingly expressionless gaze. "Never mind, I'll do it. The elders know I've been getting enough practice at it lately." It took him a while after he reached the balcony to catch his breath. Half a night's sleep had not been nearly enough, and his muscles were quivering with the exertion. But he was pleased to discover that the end of his chipping knife could slide between the shutters and still give him enough leverage to lift the bar on the inside. He went through as quietly as he could, considering he was still wheezing, and paused for a moment in the cluttered room to listen. All around him were the signs of Chavin's interests and obsessions, books and containers on every surface, caskets and sacks spilling their contents, apothecary chests with the drawers left open, as though the physician had made one last hurried search of his belongings before rushing out the door. Nothing was too dusty, though. Chert decided that the housekeeper must have given it a good cleaning before she left. Still, he stood silent for a long time, feeling like a thief, until he was certain that nothing was stirring anywhere around him. He wondered briefly about the chunk of stone that Flint had brought back. Such a long time ago it seemed now. But to find anything in this hodgepodge would be the work of hours, if not days. He hurried down the winding stairs and let Gil in through the front door. "Follow me," he told him. He couldn't assume anything was obvious to this strange, fish-eyed fellow. Chert led him down through several floors to the bottommost corridor and its featureless hallway, where he was startled almost into a scream by a furry shape that scuttled out of the shadows in front of his feet. But it was only a spotted black and gray cat, who stopped and gave him a stare as arrogant as Gil's. It seemed healthy and well-fed. He wondered if it had found the larder and was making a home of the observatory, now that the house was empty. "Well met," Gil said as they all stood poised on the stairway. It certainly seemed that he was talking to the cat. Creature did not appear impressed. She showed the two of them her tail as she trotted past them up the stairs. In the featureless corridor at the bottom of the house, Chert heard a noise from behind a small and otherwise unexceptional door that made him stop and snatch at his companion's arm to halt him as well. In other circumstances, Chert would have said someone in the room was moaning, although the voice did not sound much like anything human. But in the deserted house of a man with many arcane interests, he was less certain. In fact, he was only sure that he didn't want anything to do with it, even if it was only the sound of some odd mechanical device of Chavin's, some tangle of leather hoses and bellows and glass pipes. After a heart-stuttering moment, he pulled Gil past the spot and down to the door at the end, with the bell hanging beside it. It was a relief to close that door behind them, to be out of the empty house and into the clean but crude Funderling tunnels he knew so well. "We should be no deeper than the stronghold here," he whispered to his companion. "Can you stand it?" Gil nodded. "Good. Follow on then. We've got a long distance to walk." Chert did not have either the time or inclination to visit Boulder for any of the glowing coral. So it was with a conventional and very smoky oil lamp, throwing huge shadows on the pale, sweating walls of the limestone cavern, that he led Gil through the deep places underneath Bren's Bay. At other times, Chert thought it would have been interesting to take this old route, from a time when Funderlings had less trust of their larger brethren, for good reason, and wished an escape to be available at all times. The old Exodus road was largely unused these days, untended in many crumbling places, and navigable only with the help of a long rime Chert's father had taught him, that marked off the turnings as it wound from the outer reaches of Funderling Town, through dripping caverns beneath the bay, and at last to the mainland. The current circumstances robbed the trip of any pleasure for Chert, not to mention his recent memories of having made his way beneath the silvery sea in the depths, plagued by nightmare visions every step of the way. This journey was not nearly so difficult, although it was much longer. Only the behavior of his companion made the experience anywhere near as frightening. Gil, in fact, seemed to be suffering, as Chert himself had suffered deep in the mysteries, beset by things invisible to the Funderling, muttering, even once or twice speaking in an unfamiliar language. It was only after the lean stranger experienced his third or fourth such seizure that Chert finally realized he had seen something like this before. Flint, down in the Eden family tomb. The crack in the earth there. Something suddenly occurred to him, something he should have thought of before. Did Flint know? Was that why he acted so crosswise in the tomb? Did he know he must one day go down there? Or did it frighten him because it called to him, and it was only a few days ago that the call finally became too strong to resist? As they reached the far side, where the paths turned upward again, his odd companion went through yet another change, this time as though a layer of his strangeness had actually been scrubbed away. Gil began to ask questions about where they were and how long it would take them to get to the surface, but it seemed as though they could have come from the mouth of an ordinary man. Chert couldn't compass it, and didn't try. Far too much of what had happened in these last days he not only didn't understand, but felt sure he never would. The underground way reached the surface at last on the mainland, in a bank of seaside cliffs half a mile or so north of where the causeway had stretched. As they made their way out into the daylight, or as much of it as there was on this bleak, misty afternoon, Chert saw the castle they had left behind looming just across the strait, like a toy decorously carved by a giant and set down in the water to wait his return. From this distance, Chert couldn't even see the sentries on the wall. The keep looked deserted, its windows empty as the cliff holes above his head where the shorebirds nested in spring. It was hard to believe there were any living souls at all, inside that castle or beneath it. He tried to shrug off the bleak thought. We're on the other side of the water. Where do we go now? Into the city. Those tunnels? Have I ever been in them before? I don't know, said Chert, surprised. I shouldn't think so. Very much they remind me of something. Some place I once knew well. For the first time, Chert could see actual emotion written on the man's features, in his troubled eyes. But I cannot summon it to my thoughts. Chert could only shrug and start down the beach. Soon the sea walls of the city were looming above them. Only the base of the causeway remained where Market Road reached the shoreline, and the sea was empty into the distance, but a few tethered boats still floated along the quay, their owners taking their chances in the keep, no doubt, hoping one day soon to reclaim them. Otherwise, the docks and the waterfront taverns and warehouses were deserted. It was stunningly empty, and Chert could not help staring. It looked as though some great wind had come and blown all the people away. Fear stabbed at him anew. It wasn't just his own life. All the world had turned topside down. It was Gil who now took the lead, the Thunderling who followed. Let me start that one again. It was Gil who now took the lead, the Thunderling who followed with increasing reluctance. A mist had crept down out of the hills and covered the city, so that they could see only a few dozen paces ahead of them, even on wide Market Road. The empty buildings on either side seemed more like the silent wrecks of ships lying on the sea bottom than anything wholesome. The damp walls and guttered roofs dripped like the deepest limestone caverns, so that their footsteps seemed to echo away multifold on all sides in 1,000 tiny pattering sounds. Everything was so gloomy and unnatural that when a half-dozen dark figures stepped out of the shadows before them, it seemed like so much like the inevitable ending to a terrible dream that Chert did little more than gasp and stop in his tracks, blood thumping. One of the lean figures stepped forward, leveling a long black spear. His armor was the color of lead, and nothing showed of his face but a bit of bone-white skin and the cat-like yellow gleam of the eyes in the slot of his helmet. The point of the spear moved from Chert to Gil and settled there. The apparition said something in a voice full of harshly musical clicking and hissing. To Chert's dull astonishment, Gil responded after a moment in a slower version of the same incomprehensible tongue. The gray-armored figure answered back, and the exchange went on. Water dripped. The sentries moved up behind their leader, nothing much of them visible but tall shadows and a half-circle of burning yellow eyes. "It seems we are to be killed," Gil said at last. He sounded a little sad about this, wistful, perhaps. "I told them we bear an important thing for their mistress, but they do not seem to care. They are victorious, they say. There are no bargains left to be made." Chert fought against panic that threatened to clamp his throat, choke him. "What's that mean? You said they would want what we have. Why do they want to kill us?" "You?" Gil actually smiled, a sad twitch the corners of his mouth. "They say because you are a Sunlander, you must die. As for me, it seems I am a deserter, and thus also to be executed. She who has conquered, she was my mistress once." He shook his head slowly. "I did not know that. Given time, it may have helped me understand other things. But it seems that time is what we do not have." And indeed, as Gil spoke, the semicircle tightened around them. Spear points hovered in front of their bellies, an ample supply for both of them. The only choice was to die standing up or running away. "Farewell, Chert of Blue Quartz," his companion said. "I'm sorry I brought you here to die, instead of leaving you in your tunnels to find your own time and place." Chapter 38. Silent. In the dark green. Whisper. Now see the blink and flicker of something swift. It is alive. It is alive. From the Bonefall Oracles. Quiniton stood in the corridor outside Luyan's chambers like someone blasted by a demon's spell, amazed and defeated, waiting for death to come and take her. When a dozen or so heartbeats had passed, her hopeless terror ebbed, if only a little. She didn't want to give up, she realized. What if darkness was like sleep, and that huge, terrible something was waiting for her there as well? Except in death, there would be no waking, no escape from that black and gaping mouth. She slowly shook her head, then slapped at her own cheeks, trying to make herself feel again. If she wanted to live, she would have to escape from the autarch's own palace, an impossible task under the eyes of all his guards. And not just the guards. Soon every servant would be watching for her too, and everyone else in the seclusion. Royal wives and gardeners and hairdressers and kitchen slaves. A glimmer of an idea came to her. She forced herself to move, lurching back down the corridor to step through the hanging into Lulian's chamber. Even knowing what she would find, it was impossible to suppress a groan of horror when she saw the sprawled body in the center of the floor, although the purple face was turned away from her. The strangling cord was so deeply embedded in the favored's wattled neck that most of it was invisible. Lulian's murderer had found that thick throat hard going. A muddy boot print stood out starkly on the middle of the back of Lulian's white nightdress, like a religious insignia on the robe of a penitent. Quiniton was fighting her roiling stomach when a huge, fresh wave of misery washed through her. Oh, Lulian! She had to turn away. If she looked any longer, she would start weeping again and never move until they came for her. She was rummaging furiously through Lulian's baskets and chests of belongings when she heard a sound behind her. Her hands flew up to protect her neck as she turned, certain she would confront the grinning, dead-eyed face of Tanisa. But the rustling noise had been made by the mute slave boy, the silent favored who had brought her Lulian's message. As she tried to hide herself deeper into the room's naked corner. Let me start that one again. Her hands flew up to protect her neck as she turned, certain she would confront the grinning, dead-eyed face of Tanisa. But the rustling noise had been made by the mute slave boy, the silent favored who had brought her Lulian's message, as he tried to hide himself deeper into the room's naked corner. She had walked right past him. "Little idiot! You can't stay here!" She was about to chase him out the door, then realized she might be throwing away the one thing that could save her life. "Wait! I need some of your clothes. Can you do that? Some breeches like the ones you're wearing? I'll need a shirt, too. Do you understand?" He looked at her with the wide eyes of a trapped animal, and she realized he had been even closer to Lulian's killing than she had. Still, she had no time to spare on sympathy. "Do you understand? I need those clothes now. Then you can go. Tell no one you were here." Quiniton almost laughed at her own fatal foolishness. "Of course you will tell no one. You can't talk. No matter. Go!" He hesitated. She grabbed his thin arm and pulled him upright, then gave him a shove. He hurried out of the door, bent so low his hands almost trailed on the floor tiles, as though he were crossing a battlefield where arrows flew. She turned back to her search, and a few moments later found Lulian's stitchery basket. She took out the jewel-handled scissors, a present from the queen of the favored, Fusi, and thus hardly ever used, and began to shear off her own long black hair. Even after she had taken the pile of clothes and thanked him, the boy would not go. She gave him another push, but this time he resisted her. "You must leave. I know you're frightened, but you can't let anyone find you here." He shook his head, and although terror still filled his eyes, his refusal seemed more than just fear. He pointed at the other room. Quiniton could see the naked feet through the doorway, as though Lulian had merely decided to lie down on the floor for a nap, and then at himself, then at Quiniton. "I don't understand." She was getting frantic. She had to get out, and quickly. The chances were good that Tanisa had already checked her room and was now looking for her all through the seclusion, perhaps raising the alarm. Just go! Go to Cusi or one of the other important favored. Run! He shook his head again, sharply, and again his finger traveled from the corpse to himself to Luyan. He looked at her with imploring eyes, then mimed what she realized after a moment was writing. Oh, the sacred bees! You think they will kill you too? Because of the letters? She stared at him, cursing Luyan even though it was beyond the laws of charity to besmirch the dead before they had received the judgment of Nushash. Luyan had ensnared them all. She and that handsome, foolishly arrogant Jadi. It was bad enough what the two of them had done to Quiniton, but to this poor, speechless boy. Right, she said after a long moment. She remembered what Jadine was probably going through at this very moment, and her anger died like a snuffed candle. You'll come with me, then. But first help me get these clothes on and clean away the hair I chopped off. You can't burn it, since anyone would know that smell, so we'll have to put it down the privy. And here's another important thing. We'll need Luyan's writing box, too. The boy immediately proved his worth by leading her out of Luyan's rooms and down a back corridor Quiniton hadn't even known existed, skirting the garden of Queen Sodan entirely, which would be full of wives and servants after the evening meal, especially on a warm night like this one. They encountered only one other person, a Hakitani wife or servant carrying a lamp. It was hard to tell which, because Hakitani women all wore veiled masks and shunned ostentatious dress. The masked woman went past with no reaction whatsoever, not even a nodded greeting. Even in the midst of a desperate escape, Quiniton felt a reflexive irritation until she realized that the woman saw only two slave boys, and no matter what the woman herself might be, they were still beneath her notice. I should be thanking the Holy Hive instead of grumbling. The closer they got to the lily gate of the seclusion, the faster her heart beat. Loose hairs were working their way down the back of her neck, making the rough cloth of the boy's shirt feel even more maddeningly itchy. But that was the least of her problems. Many more people were in the corridors now. Servants off to shop for their mistresses, slaves with bundles piled high on their heads or shoulders, some even pulling small carts. A female peddler with a wheeled cage full of parrots, a favored doctor in an immense nodding hat, arguing with a favored apothecary on their way to examine the herbs at a local market. And although the presence of each person added to her fretfulness, especially the 2 or 3 servants she thought she recognized, she also told herself that the crowding made others less likely to notice 2 favored boys, and certainly a lot less likely to wonder whether one of those 2 boys might be a bride of the living God. Still, it was all Quiniton could do to stand in the crowd waiting at the alcove on the seclusion side of the gate, when every instinct told her to shove her way through and bolt to freedom. Just let them try to catch her. She did her best to slow her breathing, tried to think of what she would do on the other side. Small fingers curled around her hand, and she looked down at the boy. Despite his own wide, fearful eyes, he nodded his head and did his best to smile, as if to tell her that all would be well. I don't know your name, she whispered. What is your name? His mouth twisted, and she felt cruel. How could he tell her? Then he smiled again and lifted his hands. He laced his thumbs together with the fingers held out on either side, then let the fingers flap like wings. Bird? He nodded happily. Your name is Bird? He frowned and shook his head, then pointed up to the ribbed ceiling. Here, so close to the gate, the remains of nests still stood in some of the shadowed angles. She could see no birds in any of them. Nest? He shook his head again. A kind of bird? Yes? Sparrow? Thrush? Pigeon? He grabbed her hand again and squeezed, nodding vigorously. Pigeon? Your name is Pigeon. Thank you for helping me, Pigeon. She looked up and discovered they had almost reached the front of the line, which narrowed like a bottle's neck before a trio of large favored guards. The lily gate was only a few paces away, glowing with the lantern lights of the outside world, like something magical from a story. Two of the guards were busy looking through a peddler woman's cart before releasing her back into the city. Dwarfed by them, the peddler wore an expression that was so obviously and carefully no expression that it was almost insolent in itself. But the third guard was all too ready to look over Quinniton and her companion. Where are you going? He began, but was interrupted by Pigeon making grunting noises. Ah, one of the tongueless whelps. Whose business? Quinniton's stomach lurched. She had worked so hard on her other forged letter that she had completely forgotten she would have to produce some kind of permission to leave the seclusion as well. Slaves, even the relatively select silent favored, could not simply wander in and out at will. An instant before she would have broken and run, the boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silvery article the size of a finger and showed it to the guard. Quinniton's heart climbed into her mouth. If it was Luyen's seal stick, then the word had already gone out. Ah, for old Cusey, is it? The guard waved his hand. Don't want to make the queen of the seclusion grumpy, do we? He stepped aside, glancing with idle but focused curiosity at Quinniton, as though he sensed that something about her was not quite right. She dropped her eyes and silently recited the words of the bee's hymn as Pigeon steered her past the huge guard and in behind the peddler woman, who was just being released, apparently innocent of contraband. They say they were lovers once, one of the guards who'd been searching the cart said quietly as he stepped out of the peddler's way. Quinniton was startled until she realized he was talking to the other guard. Him? And the Evening Star? Asked his companion, equally quiet. You're joking. That's what they say. The guard's voice dropped even lower, to a whisper. Quinniton only heard a little of what he said before the pair of guards had fallen too far behind her. But even if she cared for him still, she couldn't do him any good now. Nothing between the seas can help him. Jetting? Were they talking about jetting? Quinniton felt hollow, scorched, as though all her feelings had been burned away. The world had seemed mad enough, but today it had spun into realms of lunacy she could not have dreamed existed. It was a warm evening and the streets were crowded. Outside the seclusion, the thoroughfare was full of expensive shops and tea houses. Proximity to the great palace was almost infinitely desirable, no matter what the trade. And Quinniton felt such a sense of relief and joy to be free among the loud and cheerful throng that it almost overcame the horror that still gripped her. But the feeling did not last long. Not only had she seen someone close to her murdered, she had now flouted one of the autarch's gravest laws. Even if by some strange chance she might have been allowed to live despite Jedin's and Luyen's crimes and her connection to them, the moment she had passed that door, she had sullied herself. The autarch would have no use at all for a sullied bride of unimportant parents. I might as well be dead, she thought, a ghost on the desert wind. It was a curious feeling, both empty and exhilarating. As they wound their way down through the hanging lamps of the market district and closer to the dark waterfront, the crowds became less friendly, the criminal element less cautious, and the menace increasingly tangible. As they passed down an alleyway between two long buildings, the only light that leaked in from a shabby tea house at one end with its shutters half raised, she realized fatal misfortune was almost as likely to take them here as in the very heart of the autarch's palace. She would never have come to such a place in her woman's clothes, but there were many unpleasant folk who would be just as happy with a pair of comely boys, especially those who presumably could not scream for help. Little Pigeon also sensed the danger. It would have taken someone not just mute, but blind and deaf to miss it, and he allowed Quinniton to hurry him along toward the docks. As they stepped out of yet another narrow, dimly lit alley into Sailmaker's Row, a wide road whose other end touched the shipyards and the nearest part of the docks, they found a tall shape standing in the road as if waiting for them. "Hello, wee ones." The stranger wore sailor's garb, the pants barely below his knees and a mariner's cloth wrapped around his head. But his clothes were ragged and his voice shook like a sick man's. "And what brings you wandering down here at this time of the night? Are you lost?" He took a step toward them. "Let a friendly hand help." Quinniton hesitated for only a moment. He stood between them and their destination, but the autarch's wrath was behind them and they could not turn back. Then she grabbed Pigeon's hand and started toward the stranger at speed. The boy hesitated only enough to make a slight drag on her hand, then he leaped forward and ran beside her. The man stood, his arms spread, but his dark sunken eyes wide with surprise. When they hit him, he was knocked onto his back. He rolled there for a moment, cursing, before scrambling to his feet. "You peace cods, you puppies, I'll have your innards out," he shrieked. "I'll spike you and gut you." He was up and after them now, and although he was at least a dozen steps behind, when Quinniton looked back over her shoulder, he seemed to be closing the distance rapidly. "Where are we going?" she gasped, but Pigeon did not know any better than she did and could only run beside her. The boy was faster than her, she realized, but he paced her, still holding her hand. "What did Gideon's letter say? A temple? Was it? The boat moored across from a temple? But what temple?" They came down out of Sailmaker's Row and onto the quay, their pursuers' steps banging on the boards not far behind them. Quinniton slowed and almost stopped, daunted by the horrible sight of hundreds upon hundreds of masts, of boats lined in their slips for what looked like a mile, all bobbing in turn as gentle waves from the mild night sea ran down the length of the quay. The footsteps grew louder, and she began to sprint again. "Little scallops!" The man panted. He seemed almost at their shoulders, and Quinniton reached for her last strength to stay ahead of him. I eat little scallops!" In desperation, she began to shout as loud as she could, "Hoy! The Morning Star! Morning Star! Where are you?" until she ran out of breath. There was no reply, although she thought she saw movement on some of the dark ships. Now they all ran in silence, the man behind them wheezing but not slowing. "Morning Star!" Quinniton screamed. "Where are you?" "Just up a few slips," someone shouted from one of the boats as they passed. Quinniton stumbled, but Pigeon held her up. "Morning Star!" she shouted again, or tried, but her voice seemed quiet and strengthless, her legs soft as cushions. She could barely summon breath. "Morning Star!" "Here!" a voice shouted from a short way ahead. "Who's there?" Quinniton yanked Pigeon up what she hoped was the correct gangplank. The man who had been chasing them stopped, hesitated for a moment, then turned away and took a few staggering steps into the shadows and was gone from sight. Quinniton leaned on the ship's rail, gazing as the stars in the sky seemed to drift down and swirl around her like sparks. The masts and rigging were all around her too, like some kind of forest draped in spider webs, but she was able to take in nothing else except burning air. A rough hand grabbed her arm and straightened her up, thrusting a lantern into her face. "Who are you? You shout as if you want to wake the dead." "Is this the morning star of Kuros?" she gasped. "It is. Who or what are you?" She thought she could see squinting eyes and a dark beard behind the lantern, but it was hard to face the light. "We come from Jedim." Then her knees unlocked, and the world spun around, the masts whirling like merrymaking dancers as she fell into first gray, then black emptiness. And look at that, right on time at the end of the section. Isn't that nifty? Not that it happens that way very often, but every now and then it does. It's always very satisfying. It's like getting that last squeeze on the petrol pump, and it comes out right to an even dollar amount or euro amount, since I'm talking to many Europeans, or pound amount, since I'm talking to people in North Yorkshire. Anyway, so that's it for this evening, and I am going to be back tonight at 7 p.m. to read some more as we meet the captain of the Morning Star of Kuros and find out what's going to happen next in Quinniton's adventure. And then I don't remember what happens after that, but I'm sure it's tons of fun. And so, having said all that, excuse me, I want to thank you, as always, for joining me and giving me somebody to read to, so I'm not just screaming into the void. Not that I don't spend time screaming into the void. It's kind of an exercise for me daily. I get up. Some people do affirmations. Some people do yoga. Some people stretch. I get up in the morning, have a cup of coffee, and scream into the void. But anyway, that's off the subject. What I did want to say is thank you so much for joining me. Be good to yourselves. Be good to your loved ones, your friends and neighbors, the people around you. Help take care of others and take care of your own as well. And we will all survive and triumph, and we will dance on the other side, wherever that other side may turn out to be. So again, thank you, good night, and peace. See you soon.